ask Professor Hunczak. I have not, in fact, asked him before this panel, but I'd like to ask him what were the reactions to his talk in Israel and in other places in the United States where he's put forward his conception of Jewish-Ukrainian relations.
The topic of my talk at Hebrew University was even more intriguing. It was called the Germans, Ukrainians, and the Jews. I mean, that is a deadly trio, right? Now, the immediate response was that what I was saying, that I am, as one gentleman got up and said, although I don't know anything about what Professor Hunczak spoke, it is obvious to me that he is whitewashing the Ukrainians. So, to which I responded that there was a very popular song in the United States during World War I, which went something like this: I don't know where I'm going, but I am on my way. But in a more serious vein, there were these questions of collaboration and a question of testimonies. Now, you understand, unlike the Ukrainians, who don't create any documentation, there are literally Ukrainians that I know were involved because they told me in saving Jews, and I pleaded with them, please write me one-page letter, having certified it, so that it becomes a document. You'll never get past the plea. Unlike the Ukrainians, the Jews have mountains of depositions. But prior to my talk, for about 4 days, I studied at Yad Vashem some of these depositions. And it became obvious to me, and Professor Friedman, in his article, a fair historian, that he says, well, of course you cannot take these things on face value. Because many of these depositions, they are created under special emotional, in a special emotional atmosphere. And what I explained to them, that on the basis of my reading of these depositions, is obvious that the history can never be, if you use them carelessly, you can never write an exact record of what actually has happened. Although we'll probably never do it anyway. Because, you know, history is very difficult to recreate. You know, even today's event, tomorrow people will see it already differently. To say nothing of such, you know, tragic period. But let me give you some examples how I illustrated where this problem lies. And because I brought these documents with me, there is one report, oh, here it is, by Jacob Greenberg, who says that he and a group of other Jews were fleeing from Ternopil region to Berezhane through the woods, like so many hunted animals. And in the woods, they came across 43 Jewish bodies, 43 Jews who were murdered. What is the conclusion? No, nobody's there. He says it's a good thing that nobody was around, because it would have happened to us, right? So nobody to tell you who did it. This is in Polish, this report. Była to robota Ukraińców. It was the work of the Ukrainians. And as I went through these archives, and I have discovered these cavalier judgments by these people. They were in the hiding, for example. So many people say we were in the hiding, what have you. But such and such a person was discovered and was shot. He was denounced by the Ukrainians. How do you know? And there is this constant, all-pervasive tendency that whenever, if you don't know, in case you don't know, stick it on the Ukrainians. It's like, you know, if you put on a machine mud and it will spin around, you know, just in case, throw it in that direction. Maybe it'll stick. And that is the impression I have, and I think that it's some of these depositions, while they are useful and tragic, you know, for personal insights and what have you. And it's difficult even to narrate some of the stories that I have. But where the Ukrainians are concerned, this is an inevitable, inescapable judgment. The Ukrainians did that. Name me one, would be my suggestion. Now, when they are saved by specific Ukrainians, and I have here a list among those who were saved by the Ukrainians. But when it comes to the people who were denounced, they were also denounced by Ukrainians. How did they know? More than that, even such outstanding historian as Hilberg, whom I quoted earlier, even he engages in this sort of thing. The destruction of European Jews. I don't know whether you saw this monumental study of his, excellent study in so many ways. He writes on page 585, he says, and I quote, "Little is known about the guard forces of Belzec and Sobibor, except that they numbered in the hundreds, and that again, they were mostly Ukrainian." Now, if little is known or nothing is known about them, right, how do you know that they were Ukrainians? And a lot of this is, I think, this lies at the root of the problem. It is not the problem, documenting the people who committed criminal acts. I hope that they are all apprehended, and I hope they are all punished. I have no sympathy for criminals, Ukrainians, Jews, or otherwise. I happen to truly believe in a just society. And criminals should be punished. Criminals, yes. But this reminds one more of a witch hunt, right? And that's something I'm not in sympathy with. At any rate, so the response to Yurko's question was that there was a very lengthy 2-hour discussion on my presentation, exchange of views, which I think is very useful, ladies and gentlemen, because if peoples close themselves into groups, all they do is exercise their collective hang-ups. Whereas if they share views, if they discuss problems, they finally iron out their misunderstanding. So I thought that my visit to Israel in that respect was rather useful. I hope I answered at least part.
Well, since you're going to be a panelist in the next session, the last session,
all
I'm sure
right.
you'll clarify. I have questions following our format of people that submitted, and I'm actually going to try and get through all of them. Let's try and ask the first one. I beg specificity. With whom did the German leadership deal with in Ukraine? On what basis can these Ukrainians be considered to be collaborators? I think this is somewhat of a repetition of your talk, but perhaps, would you care to answer that?
Well, it's very easy. There are specific directions from the Ministerium für die besetzten Ostgebieten, it's called, the Rosenberg Ministry, but they had separate offices. At any rate, the directions say, we shall not permit any central Ukrainian representation of any sort. We will only permit the HIVS committee, the UCK, essentially, Ukrainian, what do you call it in English? Dopomohove auxiliary, not the auxiliary, what is the English? Relief, the Ukrainian Relief Committee. That's the only one that they permitted to be a centralized bureau. That larger cities were to be subject to the immediate German authority, what have you. The Ukrainians could they exercise authority on behalf of the German government in the villages. Let's say if Starosta was appointed. Well, he still was a German agent of the Third Reich. He was not representative of the Ukrainian people. Is that what you have in mind?
That's the question.
What was the say again?
No, it's exactly as I put it.
Uh-huh.
Okay, this is somewhat of a supplementary question, but perhaps you just stand at the podium since you're going to be asked it. In light of the current accusations, it would be useful to know what are the facts about the activities of the auxiliary Ukrainian police against the Jews. Do the activities constitute, quotation marks, atrocities, end of quote? Second part, does the fact that Ukrainians were not accountable to a Ukrainian authority, but to the Nazi regime, is it your position that this absolves Ukrainian individuals of responsibility if they committed atrocities?
No individual is absolved from committing atrocities. The Nuremberg trial established precisely that. Whether somebody was in a German force or the auxiliary police doesn't matter. You are guilty for acts committed, for acts of inhumanity. And there is no way anybody can possibly be absolved. As far as the police participation, now there is a lot of conflicting evidence. For example, I have a report of Sicherheitsdienst from Lviv. If you read some of the depositions of the Jews who were there, and then the Ukrainians, well, it's a holy confusion. Now, my question is this. Can we be selective? On the one hand, can we say that you cannot trust the Germans? But after all, the Germans were very good record keepers. Although I can show you many documents where where evidence was fabricated also. One has to be, historians, the first thing they learn is source criticism, right? How does one approach a document? So here is a problem. Philip Friedman, for example, is very, very critical of, in approaching the German evidence. Raoul Hilberg, on the other hand, uses it as, alpha and omega, essentially. And if you look through his book, they are reports from the Ereignismeldungen and Meldungen aus den besetzten Ausgebildeten, two types, they are bi-weekly reports, which I happen to have all of them because I spent some years collecting documentation. Now, he uses them religiously, and there are a few places where I will have to check out because it seems to me that they couldn't be true in a few cases. It's a problem, you see. Now, he establishes the participation of auxiliary police in some of, even in the shootings of the Jews. The German documents, when you read them, speak that when they were in the action, the people were such and such a Sonderkommando or such police battalion, and the auxiliary Hilfspolizei, Schutzmannschaft, whatever it was, participating. You don't know the level of participation, you see? And that's where some of the problems lie. I, being somewhat of a purist, I am very reluctant to say that they did not participate or that they participated. Those that wish them to participate will immediately say, they were there, they were shooting, what have you. Well, that's somewhat, irresponsible approach to history. There must be another point should be made, ladies and gentlemen, about this administration, particularly in the territories east of the Dnipro, in the eastern Ukraine. I have read all of these German documents pertaining to the occupational policy, what have you, and I came to the conclusion, and besides the German documents bear this out, that many of the people in the administration were people who were left behind, and in the police, were people who were left behind by the communists because they had time to leave behind an organization, network, something they did not do in Western Ukraine. But in the Eastern Ukraine, remember, the Germans came to Kiev only on September 19th. The Soviets had plenty of time. So they left behind a whole network of agents and what have you. Many of them penetrated the German administrative apparatus and in the police. For example, there is one story, let me, if I may indulge a little in telling you a few little stories. There is a story about a woman, I forgot the town, but I have the document, where a woman comes to the German Gestapo, and she cries. She said, "Do you know what happened? This man, Dobrovolsky, shot my husband." Dobrovolsky was the chief of the local police. And she says, do you know who Dobrovolsky is? Just before you came in, he was major in NKVD. So the Germans conducted what they call Vernehmung. They investigated him and shot him, finally. This is only one of the stories, but the Germans were quite aware that in their administrative apparatus in eastern Ukraine, there were many people who were working against them. So, you know, you truly have to be very careful about these things. You cannot simply say, after all, some of them may be heroes now of the Soviet Union who were shooting people on behalf of the Germans. The reason for that, of course, was simple. They wanted to create a spirit of confrontation between the Germans and the Ukrainians, so the Ukrainians would go with the Soviets. And what better way to do it than to shoot a few people here and there? So that's another consideration. World War II, there is such a wealth of conflicting information that you really have to be irresponsible to make a categorical judgment. For that reason, I'll probably never write my book. Although I do hope to finish it, God willing, in the near future.
Many of the questions, in fact, deal with many issues that we'll be discussing later in the day, such as the whole role of disinformation and so on by the Soviet Union, or at least what some of the people have suggested as disinformation. I will simply ask Professor Hunczak and Mr. Yurkevich if they'd like to make a summation based on the discussion so far and a final statement before we break for lunch in 2 minutes.
To summarize, then, not speaking on my own behalf, but summarizing the chapter of which I read the major excerpts. Professor Hrycenko argued that while there was an initial lack of information and some naivete about German intentions in occupying Ukraine, this was very swiftly dispelled by the Germans themselves. There was a brief initial period in which Ukrainians took advantage of the flight of Soviet officialdom to reactivate Ukrainian life. But then, as was detailed in the chapter, the Germans set about destroying all elements of independent Ukrainian activity, establishing their own administration, and bringing about a regime of extremely severe repression against all aspects of Ukrainian national activity, and ensuring that Ukraine would work as much as possible to support the German war effort. This, in turn, aroused intense hatred of the German occupation regime. It impelled Ukrainians either to go into the underground or to join both the Soviet partisans and the Red Army, and it led to an increase in national consciousness which even Stalin had to recognize.
It would be easier to give another lecture than to summarize, but basically I think one can reduce the problem to the following propositions. Number one, the Ukrainians found themselves in a very difficult situation politically, and because of the repressive regime that came in and because of a lack of leadership, established leadership. And for that reason, they were groping for solutions and I would say certainly made some mistakes. That's referring to the organized community, particularly the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. But as time progressed, they learned their lesson. While fighting for the Ukrainian cause, they saw Ukrainian cause in a wider perspective as a cause for a just Ukrainian state, which included everybody all of the national minorities. And that's very important point, that in the midst of the war, a terrible war, people take the time to say, we want to be a just society. That's a very important point. Point two is indeed there were Ukrainians who, in pursuit of whatever personal gains, collaborated. Some committed crimes, but they were just that, individuals. They should, to say Ukrainians did that, this, that, or another thing, is simply to do violence to history. For the Ukrainians, as a social entity, are a complex organism. And within that organism, there are all kinds of people. En masse, as it is borne out by evidence, the Ukrainians behaved decently. They not only pursued their own goals with integrity and dedication, but they even took time to save those who were even in greater trouble, the Jews. And I hope that future historians will approach this problem more with Cine Era and et Studio, will approach in an unbiased fashion so that we may be given a more truthful record of what had actually transpired.
Several brief announcements. I'd like to remind our speakers and the press, of course, of the press conference at 12:30 upstairs in the boardroom. Again, I'd like to thank the speakers and have a good lunch. Thank you.